Hello, how are you doing? Nice to see you. Let's have a cup of tea. What I wanted to talk to you today about is about how we can improve our relationships. I'm Nadia and I'm someone with lived experiences of neurodiversity, which feeds into my relationship, so it means that I've learned a lot about how to navigate this field. I also have a master's in equalities, so relationships are a lot about how these things play out. And a lot of my thinking about this has come from a podcast called the Meg-John and Justin podcast, who are my favourite people ever, and a really great podcast. It's like changed my life for the better. I'd really recommend checking them out if you're interested in this field. Firstly, it is really helpful to acknowledge that our culture isn't very good in teaching us how to have healthy relationships. There's a lot of kind of non-consensual culture that we exist in, and obviously we associate consent with intimacy. A lot of our culture is quite non-consensual in a wider sense, and that kind of feeds into unhealthy relationships and unhealthy relationship dynamics. It's fairly normal behaviour, for example, to pressurise someone to go to the pub. And if someone really doesn't want to do that, that creates a difficult dynamic. It might create some resentment for the person that doesn't want to go to the pub but then ends up going. And improving our relationships is really about bringing consent culture in to those relationships more and more. You can get to a place where people really are on the same level, people are doing things that they want to do, committing to what they want to commit to, and that's really the optimum place for relationships to be in, whether that's friendships, family relationships or romantic relationships. When people mutually want something and they have it between each other, then that's the healthiest place that you can be in. With my background in equalities work, it's quite clear that we come from quite loaded histories, and they don't really teach us how to have healthy relationships, and they really do centre around non-consensual behaviour a lot of the time. And again, I mean romantically, but I also, or intimately, but I also mean beyond intimacy as well. So for example, the assumption that friends have to be your friends forever until you both die, that's not the most consensual assumption around friendship, but that's kind of repeated everywhere in cartoons and everywhere. Assuming that people are going to be together until they die can often worsen the quality of the relationship. So that comes to my second point on improving your relationships, and that is acknowledging the finiteness of relationships. And obviously that can be quite scary, but what I mean is, if we treat people badly, that there is a probability even that could end the relationship and the dynamic. It can really enable us to feel reflective and accountable and consensual in our behaviour, because we acknowledge that this friendship might not last forever if I'm not a good friend. These family relationships might not be so close if we misbehave. But the assumptions that we're going to be tight forever is feeds into, like, people just start taking people for granted a lot of the time and assuming that they can do whatever and they'll be fine. And that's one of the issues that comes up in marriages, is that people can start taking each other for granted. And I'm not taking away marriage as a beautiful, important thing for some people, but I think the statistics show that there are some problems with that arrangement. So I think we can make marriages healthy and fulfilling and important, and this is exactly the kind of process and thinking that can really feed into that. The third aspect of creating healthy relationships is getting some kind of professional support. What I mean is, we don't really come from a place which, as I said, provokes the healthiest of relationships. So having someone who is informed about supporting people through unlearning some of the unhealthy behaviours they've had before and creating a mutually sustainable dynamic is really helpful. We can do a lot on our own and we can educate ourselves a lot on tools, but because we're not experts in terms of therapy and psychology, we could be going down the wrong path sometimes. And so getting some professional support, I would highly recommend that for people. I understand that it's not easy for everyone. I think a lot can be done with ourselves if we really dedicate ourselves to this work. There are privileges that need to be acknowledged. Some genders, for example, are more easily able to express their emotions and feelings. A lot of femme and women have been encouraged to, or at least feel more able to express their true feelings compared to how we treat men a lot of the time as a culture. And so I think there are quite important issues around that. New concepts I've learned in my therapy, which has like really changed how I approach all of my relationships, is these concepts called rejection sensitivity and injustice sensitivity. Autistic people and people that have personality disorders, as well as people who have had really traumatic lives, they can often increasingly experience something called rejection sensitivity and injustice sensitivity, where they perceive a lot of things that happen in a certain way because of their past experiences. Say someone is rude to me, I might be like, oh, that's rejection. So people that have lots of experiences like that start to perceive it more and see it more, so they can more readily perceive and expect and feel a lot of distress around what they think is rejection or what they think is injustice. Now, sometimes it may or may not be those things, but it also means that they have a stronger reaction against what they perceive to be as rejection and injustice. For example, like someone could just be being rude because they are having a really shit time and they're being really grumpy and rude. And it could be because of rejection or an injustice, but it could also not be. And so that really allowed me to just kind of think about it a bit more, because looking at these things from a different perspective where you're not assuming all the time, it really helps. And I think it can also help me understand other people's behaviours as well. Say I don't take someone's advice, I know someone that takes that really badly. They go on attack mode and it's very distressing. But like I've realised that they probably perceive someone not taking their advice as a form of rejection. So people that have higher rejection and injustice sensitivity also respond a lot worse than other people that don't have those kind of experiences. So that emotionally they can get really wound up really quickly, understandably, because of past experiences and because of living in this world where they've had difficult challenges and behaviours. But obviously it's not great for them. And I'm not saying there aren't problems with therapy. Therapy comes from a very Western colonial perspective, but I think there's some forms of therapy that are trying to undo that and support people, and there are forms of therapy and support systems that can really change people's lives for the better. So certainly for me, it's definitely been a constant in my life that I've needed and that I'm really grateful for. But I also feel privileged about that. So that's why I want to share these tools with you, and I hope that it's been useful. Thank you. Little stem dance. Stem dance. I don't actually usually dance like this. It's just kind of nervous. How do I usually dance? I don't know. I can't do it in front of the camera. It's fine. Here you go. I clap a lot of the time. Clapping stem, clapping stem. So yeah, if you're having difficulties in your relationship, and your relationships with other people, it's totally understandable. Some of the bigger problems beyond ourselves include the kind of wider narratives of like the perfect relationship, the perfect marriage, the forever friends, and like all this stuff that's just very garbage. You know what I mean? Very garbage. Life isn't like that, and it's good that it's not like that. And I think that's one of the reasons why people struggle with these things, because we have these stories. We assume that everyone's relationships must look perfect on the outside, like their Instagram account. But I think this script and these stories kind of make it a bit more difficult, to really challenge the issues in our relationships and improve them. And I think that's a great shame, because it's not good to just pretend everything's hunky-dory in our family relationships when they're not okay, or romantic relationships and so on. So I would encourage people to talk about their issues with people that they trust, and try to tackle the taboo that you can't ever talk about issues, because if you feel like you need to and you need support, then that's totally valid, and it doesn't mean that a relationship is bad. For me, when I've talked to people, it's just been because I'm trying to work things out. Because I think in a very neurodiverse manner, it's quite difficult for me to work out human behaviour, conventional human behaviour. So I have to talk to people about it that I trust in like a confidential way, just because I'm just figuring out what's happening and what's the best approach. It would be very different if we lived in an autistic world or a neurodiverse world that prioritised, say, neurodivergent forms of thinking or just different forms of minds, but we just aren't in that situation. And I know it's a bit difficult because there's that stereotype that we can never talk about our issues, or our issues with our friendships or relationships, romantic ones, or family relationships, but for me, I think it is important to talk to people that you trust. This doesn't mean that it's a bad relationship, but you're just figuring things out and would appreciate some help. No one teaches us in school how to have healthy relationships, so. And again, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, then definitely look into resources like the podcast I recommended. Even if people just listen to that, their whole world might change for the better, in my view. And that's what's happened to me. It's just really been amazing. Oh my god, they're amazing. I love them. I'm like quite a fan person about them, but I don't want to freak them out, so I'm gonna delete this bit. And that brings me to my next point. I think we're on number 3, which is learning to be accountable and reflective. So this can be really difficult because we're taught to not really accept accountability, and when we're kids, if we do something wrong, we've been taught to be like, that wasn't me, that wasn't me, that was them, that was this person, it's not me. Do you see what I mean? So that kind of comes into adulthood as well. People don't really see the positives of being accountable, but there are so many, because if you're never accountable, you don't really develop as a person enough a lot of the time to have healthy relationships. If I expressed some bad behaviour, but I just never acknowledged it, then that's kind of it. It doesn't change, it doesn't improve, because how can it possibly improve if I think I'm always right and that I never do anything wrong? So it's really good for ourselves, like these kind of, when someone comes to you and asks you to be accountable for your actions, yes, it's uncomfortable and unpleasant for us, but they are opportunities, and there's lots of great support resources that you can get. For example, the Meg-John and Justin podcast have a great podcast episode on how to be accountable, which I highly recommend. I've listened to it like so many times. Then you'll be able to see, so there's lots of common reactions that people might have if you try to ask them to be accountable. Denial and deflecting and crying lots themselves to be like, poor me. It's a bit like white tears, when people of colour talk to white people about their issues, and white people are like, oh, I'm so upset. And then all the attention goes on that other person rather than the actual person that's originally been harmed. So it's useful to know what these patterns are, so you can look out for them in other people and yourselves. And being accountable is a really important part of it. And it's not easy, we're always learning these things. It's a lifetime commitment trying to have healthy relationships and to be an accountable person. It is work, but it's definitely great work. And it really feeds into making things amazing. My 4th tip, not really sure where I am, god damn it, is looking at novel tools to help manage healthy relationships. So, for example, say we're talking about romantic relationships between 2 people, and I would say miscommunication is probably one of the main reasons for a lot of difficulties in relationships. A lot of the time, miscommunication can spiral into arguments or just not great times between people. And a lot of the time that's because there's assumptions about what's happening. So there are great techniques that can help people communicate better. As a neurodivergent person, learning how to communicate is really important for me. So I've had the privilege, through my not so privileged being in an ableist world, I've learned lots of things to be able to communicate really effectively with people. So ironically, I got to a place where actually I'm quite good at it. So one good technique is doing something called a feedback loop, and that is basically when you experience a difficulty between you and a partner, or you and a friend, or anyone that you've agreed to use this technique with, you do something called the feedback loop. So you say your experience, and then you say everything that's important in this experience, and then you let the other person repeat back your experience to you, and then you do the same the other way around. And so the other person's telling you about their experience of this situation. Say like there's been confusion about what you want to watch, but then someone's taking it in a way that isn't meant, whatever. There's a weird communication thing going on. Okay. And so if you just both say your experiences, you'll be like, oh, okay, well this is not actually what I meant, and now I see your perspective, and basically it just sorts out most communication issues, because you're giving a very clear perspective of the other person's experience and your experience, and they can be so different that you start to understand the crux of where the communication confusion is coming from. Another great way of making sure you and your partner, for example, is on the right page. There's a lot that is assumed and not really spoken about, such as money, or planning fun times together, or talking about issues together. And so I really recommend something called a relationship check-in. So this is basically a meeting with you and your partner / whoever's important to you that you want to have this dynamic with, where so it could also be a housemate, for example, where you go through themes that you think are important. So I have money, intimacy, fun times, issues, chores and cleaning. And so these are times that you can just check back in with each other about where you are at with all these things. And again, we've just seen that there's lots of assumptions that were happening, and that's why some confusions were happening. And when we clarified it all in this meeting, we were like, oh, this is really easy and this is really clear. So it means that it's fed into like us going to sleep earlier so that we're not as tired, and that we can make sure we clean before we go to sleep, so everything's super tidy in the morning. The balance of chores as well is something that we've discussed and organised in a way that makes us both happy. So yeah, I really recommend these kind of exciting techniques. I just love them. I'm like gushing because they're awesome. Last but not least, plan fun, positive activities as well. I know some of this sounds like quite a lot of work, and some people don't really associate this with positive things, but this work can really be quite fun. And when you understand the people around you more, it can be really great. Relationships that are really consensual are the most fun and attractive relationships to be in. Yes, I would very much recommend prioritizing fun things and activities that you really like to do. And a lot of the time with different, relationships, there needs to be a larger amount of positive things happening compared to negative things. And obviously we can't control that all the time. There should be about, for every one thing that's challenging, ideally there'd be 4 things that are quite fun that happen or that you plan to do. And so it's really about prioritizing those things. Looking at fondness and admiration for the people around you, I think, is really important. And again, there are great exercises on that. If people have stuff like OCD and other mental health struggles or forms of distress, it can be quite hard for them to move their focus away from worrying aspects to being grateful. And we have the people in our lives most of the time, unless we feel obligated and we don't actually like them. But most of the time it's people that we really admire and that we really love and we respect, and that there's a lot to be focused on and admired and prioritized. So activities that help you change that focus if it's ever too much in the worrying about stuff. I think doing a lot to make sure you do focus on the good things and the things you love about the other person and appreciate about them. You can do gratitude jars. The more you focus on what you appreciate about someone, the more you can kind of talk about in detail, and you can get a whole jar full of amazing gratitudes about the great things about them and what you really love. And appreciate about them. I think focusing on the fun stuff and the many privileges and amazing things about having the people that are in your life, I think that's really fundamental as well. And yeah, happy having healthy relationships. It's hard to finish these things. So I'm not going to assume, healthy relationships are like, they work, and you're doing the work. And even if you're not doing the work right now, the fact that you're thinking about doing the work is also great. So, go you!